Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's Connecting Conversation. This week, we are joined by State Representative Jon Zlotnik. Thank you for being here, Jon. Um, Jon is a graduate of the MPA program, so I thought he would be a great person to come in and talk to us a little bit about how in a political position, it's important for him to stay in touch with nonprofits and how nonprofits can best advocate for themselves and work for him. So before we get into all of that, Jon, can you tell the people listening a little bit about the districts that you cover,
Sure.
how long you've been in your position, things like that?
Sure. So I'm finishing up my 11th year as a state rep. I've represented the second Worcester district the entire time, which has been the city of Gardner and the towns of Winchendon, Ashburnham, and Templeton. Also used to include the town of Westminster as well. And like you mentioned, I graduated from the SLP program in the spring of 2023.
Good. Awesome. Thank you. So I think, one of the focuses for this conversation that I'll have for you is the importance of us all really working together in a rural district because there's a lot of challenges that come with that. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the nonprofits in this district that are on your radar, MVOC excluded? They've already heard plenty about it from me. And how you interact with them each differently.
Sure. So there's kind of on the big end, there's things like MOC, the what's now Making Opportunity Count, used to be the Montezuma Opportunity Council. Then other big players like Luck Inc. And the Boys and Girls Club. And then there's kind of more niche ones, smaller end. Well, maybe I'll say mid-range, like the Gardner CAC, the Winchendon CAC. And then sort of more boutique nonprofits like the Gardner Emergency Housing Mission, which is very small, or some other kind of pop-up ones like that may not even have a physical location or full-time staff.
Yeah, actually, Gardner Emergency Housing List was on my radar to chat with you about because I know that they are super small and very new. So let's start there. Can you tell me a little bit about how a newer nonprofit might go about getting on your radar and what you might be able to do for them as they're getting started up?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that really the situation is the same, except for like the really big, like kind of corporate nonprofit entities, right, with kind of an established structure. The rest, whether it's sort of your mid-size like MVOC or the CAC or a small one like GEM, kind of all in their same bucket. And I'll say it varies. The way they've come sort of to my attention. Um, sometimes it's somebody individually reaching out from one of those organizations. Sometimes, I become aware of that organization and reach out depending on if it's something that fits in with, an item or agenda thing that I'm trying to work on, or if I see there being a fit. But it all kinds of washes out that way.
Yeah. And so what are some things that are helpful for nonprofits to keep you in the loop with? What is the benefit of them getting to know their state reps and their senators?
I'd say that the biggest thing is financial support. Whether it's direct state funding, federal funding, or even funding from, sort of the nonprofit sort of philanthropy world. It always helps, I think, to have local leadership in your corner. We can often provide contacts or recommendations, or even just lend our name to a project or a particular ask. I think that can go a long way. One of the things that I think especially state reps and state senators do a lot of is networking and sort of, what we call convening. So we often have a lot of different irons in the fire. We're kind of involved in a lot of different things. So it can be easier for us to bring different groups together or um, whether it's inside our district, outside our district, with state players, with federal players. Our offices are usually equipped and able to do that in a way that most others can't. Um, so people are going to take an invitation from our office that they might not if you just sent them an email or cold call.
Yeah. I think one of the other things that I know I've experienced, at least in working with you, is that you're really good about connecting the nonprofits to one another And I would imagine that benefits you as much as it benefits us, right? Like you connected MVOC with the Gardner CAC. We both have food pantries, and now we can share goods and excess and things like that. But I
Yeah.
would imagine on your end, it makes it a little easier for you that we all work together as well.
It does. I've always looked for those opportunities, again, kind of being in that sort of, convener role, to find ways to stretch resources further, or just find ways to be, more efficient. Or sometimes it's about, um, bundling different organizations together to perhaps go after, a bigger pot of funding, right? That
Right.
one organization may be too small to really be competitive, on their own.
Mhm.
But by sort of collaborating and presenting a group picture,
Mhm.
that can be better. Because ultimately, whether it's a private entity or the state, you need a track record, which can be tough for new organizations. But you also need to kind of assure the entity that's giving you funds that you're going to do what you say you're going to do. Um, and you're going to kind of produce the result that they're looking for. And that's often better and could be more assuring if you have, in addition to the sort of local leadership support, if you can say, oh, we're partnering with, three different nonprofits, um, that gives more assurance that things are going to get done, that there's going to be somebody responsible for carrying that out.
I think that's really it's been helpful, and I think there's noticeable results for that. Similarly, for MVOC, because we have housing, to be able to call you and say, do you know any local property developers? Do you know any landlords? And that has worked out. You connected us with a real estate agency, and now they're on our list. And when we have people looking for housing, we call them. But I think on your end too, I guess I'll ask you first, what are some of the benefits that your office gets from knowing the nonprofits really well?
I think, our office's overall objective is to, improve the quality of life in the district, generate more opportunity, things like that. So, the more we can work closely with other entities that do work in that space, because, again, my office doesn't, we don't do housing work directly. We don't do veterans work directly. But we do become kind of a focal point for a lot of those initiatives. So it helps us to have good working relationships with nonprofits that actually do that work. And it's a very symbiotic relationship because, we can facilitate things that these entities really couldn't facilitate on their own or without our support. And they help us by really accomplishing the objectives that we're setting out to do.
Yeah, I think on a hyper local level too, it's really helpful when a constituent calls you with a concern or a need to be able to say, I know this place, I trust these people, and hand it off. And I've seen that both with your
Right.
office and with a lot of the other state reps offices as well.
Right. I mean, we do, unless it's something directly involving a state issue,
Mhm.
we refer out, I would say, probably at least half of our cases end up getting referred to another entity. And that's, I'd say out of that 50%, the vast majority of those are referred to local nonprofits,
Mhm.
who are going to be able to fill that need for that constituent.
Yeah. So on your kind of like behind the scenes work of it, do you just because you've been in your position for so long, know these nonprofits? Do you keep a list? Do you have like a directory of some sort? How do you keep all of it straight, I guess?
Yes, I mean it's a little bit of everything. I mean, some of it is just doing the work and being involved. You get to know sort of the different entities that are out there. Um,
Mhm.
and that's not to say like we certainly don't partner with every entity in the district either. Some of it is uh, making a judgment call about, whether the organization is doing a good job, whether they're a good partner for us. We have to make those determinations kind of on a case by case basis, and also based on, what that nonprofit is looking to do with our office. Um, if they're looking for us to attend an event or make a speech, that's kind of very on the low end, right? And not a lot of, sort of due diligence has to go into something like that. But if the request is, for for money, that certainly heightens that. If that request is for, $22.5 million,
Who
um,
did that?
that's that's going to involve, a much more intimate relationship between my office and the nonprofit.
Yeah.
It is a bit of a sliding scale depending on what the need is and what the collaboration is, right? So, um, I always tell people this when we start getting involved in sort of directing funds that, um, it's not just here's a check or here's a letter from us, and then we're gone. The political reality of the situation is that, if we're directing, state funds at an entity or a project, we're putting sort of our office on the line
Mhm.
for that. So we're going to be involved. We're going to expect a certain amount of uh, of involvement, information sharing. We're going to do some hand holding on our own,
Mhm.
to make sure that it goes smoothly. Because once we sort of are in that kind of relationship, then we're sort of in it together. And the success of whatever we're working on is very much tied to both of us. So that's sort of on the high end, right? Like, obviously, we have that relationship with MVOC, with the Gardner CAC, and a few others, but that's sort of the more exclusive end of
Yeah.
what my office does, and I think most offices work in a similar way.
Yeah. And really, I mean, same as us, like you don't want to put your name on something that's going to get a lot of attention if you don't know enough about it and you don't trust that it's going to be excellent, I
Right, exactly. So I mean, we probably get, um, especially for funding. I mean, we easily get 3 or 4 times in dollar amount the amount of request versus how much actual cash there is to divvy up. So I mean, like, it is competitive, and that's where it goes back to sort of relationship building, having a track record, um, and making sure that goes smoothly.
Mhm.
Without, and that can go both ways. There was an entity, I won't name it, but there was an entity that my office was involved with years ago, and we had done some things together, and eventually we kind of gradually pushed back because you know we were having a hard time getting information. We were having a hard time getting updates. We were getting a lot of pushback when we'd ask certain questions or make requests for
Mhm.
information or access. Um, and eventually we just sort of ended our partnership because that's a big piece of it, especially for me, that there has to be that level of interaction, in order to be able to keep that going. Because again, like, we are tied, to a certain extent. So
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about that kind of relationship building and you mentioned you get called to, make speeches and attend events and stuff. What kind of events and goings on should nonprofits be letting your office know about, should be asking you to attend? What kind of things do you like to see out there so that you can go to?
yeah, I mean, I always say, let us know as much as you can,
Mhm.
and um, this is part of the relationship building, but obviously we're not going to be able to accommodate every request. We're not going to be able to do everything. Um, and, if we have that kind of situation, it's not going to be a problem to be like, oh, we can't do this, we can't do this, or could we possibly do it this way? That I would say that's really the goal. If you're a nonprofit, is to get to that point, with an official's office,
Yeah.
to where you can really be collaborative in that sense, because that's where, you can often find more opportunities to do more work together if you can kind of reach that level where you can, be that kind of direct.
Yeah, and it's not easy, and I think every state rep and senator has a different focuses, different things they're invested in, different things they're keeping track of, and so I think it's important for people to keep in mind, if it doesn't work out with one, it doesn't necessarily mean that your organization's doing a poor job. It's just not that administration's focus at the moment. Um,
Right. And it may not be, I always tell people this too. And you've gone through this yourself, that it's very rare that a request is granted the first time. Especially if you're going for a substantial amount of money with the state and you're a nonprofit. my experience is, unless you're one of, again, like sort of like the big sort of
Mhm.
players in that space, you might have to go 2 or 3 times, and you have to kind of factor that into your thinking, that even if you've kind of done, everything right, so to speak, that you still might have to go through that process, a couple of times.
Yeah. And I think, it's important to keep in mind, just you have an email list of who all these state reps, senators, even mayors, city councilors are.
Mm.
Build a list of who their aides are, because they're sometimes a lot more accessible than that person. And I think it's just put them on the invite list to everything, and you kind of have
Yeah.
an idea who's going to come or not, but at least you can say that you reached out.
Yeah.
I've got somebody in our district that I invite to absolutely everything. I have never seen them. I know they're not going to come, but they're invited. I put them on the quarterly newsletter.
Yeah.
I stay in touch, and that's all you can do, because we're just
Yeah.
not their focus, and you can't expect to be everybody's focus, especially for partners that may be far out of the way.
Right.
MVOC is in Gardner and you live around the corner. That's going to be a lot easier for you than a state rep or a senator who maybe lives 2 or 3 towns away,
Right.
and can't get there as easy, especially in a rural community where 2 or 3 towns away could be 45 minutes.
Right. No, I mean, that's a good thing to keep in mind. And I think the other thing too, and this is where, I mean, one, everything's political, but, it's where I think, if you're just because you're in the nonprofit world, you still have to keep that kind of stuff in mind, right?
Mhm.
And, you might get certain things from some people, and that's all you need from them, right? Like you might just need, um, someone to sign on to a letter a couple times a
Right.
year, or support someone else who's, really the driving force behind something, that might be just as good, and I think it's, um, I think the other thing that's important too is to remember kind of like it is a symbiotic relationship. And, um, you know, everybody in elected office needs to get reelected, right? So, at a certain point, like we all do have to think about that. And, that's kind of a good way, all of us do, work in the hopes that our constituents will like the work that we're doing, and will vote for us. And part of that is promoting the work that we do. And part of that work is the partnerships we have with other entities in our districts.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really did not realize when I entered the private nonprofit world is how closely affiliated with politics I would be.
Mm.
I had no idea how important the relationship is, and it is detrimental to what we're doing. Um, just to have that support, to be able to pick up the phone and ask a question, to be able to say, "Do I have a chance at going for this or
Right.
not?" Um, is just not something that I really thought would be as prevalent as it is, and I'm thinking a lot of people don't realize that.
Right. And I think some people get scared off by
Mm.
kind of the word political.
Yeah.
Um, and it's more about politics in the sense of, balancing competing interests and
Mm.
balancing personalities rather than, sort of politics in the sense of like C-SPAN. It's
Yes.
really more about, that kind of,
Yeah. It's
politics than.
conversation politics, not,
Right,
you know.
right. Kind of being, just being more engaged and aware necessarily than, it's not like your agency is going to be sort of involved in a campaign capacity or something like that, but you have to be aware of like, oh, this person's up for election, this person has that office. This is when it's, this is sort of that world. You have to be aware of that,
Yeah.
because it does, like everything we work in goes in cycles, whether it's, the fiscal year, the budget cycle, the campaign cycle, all those things, have an impact to one degree or another.
Mhm.
And, I've always thought that, to really do that job well, you have to be aware of all that, and you have to keep that in mind the same way that we keep that in mind too. We have to know, the sort of cycles that go on in the towns below us, the federal cycles, and then also, every entity has their own cycle, right? When
Mhm.
board members come on and off, uh, every entity has its own fiscal year, all those types of things, we have to keep in mind too, again, to make sure everything's going as smooth as possible.
Oh, I'm glad you said board members. That's the last thing I wanted to talk about. Particularly, we are in a rural area. We are in a generally, low to middle income area. I know you have helped me identify appropriate board members before, and you've recommended me for other boards too, because it's a smaller pool to pick
Mhm.
from when you're in spaces like that. So can you talk a little bit about how that is mutually beneficial to you to know who these people are and where they're
Yeah.
placed?
Well, I think it's in part, it's kind of like what I was talking about before about kind of developing deeper ties,
Mhm.
and deeper relationships and allowing, sort of everyone to do more working together. Very big part of my philosophy, is sort of, sort of teamwork,
Mhm.
and collaboration. And, so I think again, I think being in a position like this, I come into contact with a lot of different people,
Mhm.
because my job is sort of being, in a bunch of different places, right? So, even back to when I recommended you for, to be on MVOX board, that came about because your predecessor, who I had a very close relationship as well, asked if I knew sort of anybody in higher education space who would be a good fit and be, kind of willing to do this. And I thought of you.
Mhm.
And I think that's true, especially like you said, in rural areas where, we tend to be, spread thin.
Yeah.
Um, that networking component can be really important to make sure that, um, people are aware. I mean, because quite frankly, let's just say, I mean, if MBlock threw something in the Gardner News saying, "Hey, any board members, anyone interested in joining our board," you wouldn't get any response,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think it becomes harder and harder in rural areas to really kind of get the word out, sort of as those more traditional methods, sort of continue to dry up. And then, you're limited on your own capacity because, you could send out an email, you could put something on your own Facebook page, but you're sort of just in your own circles. So if you
Yes.
ever want to get out of those circles or find somebody that's kind of not already in your bubble,
Yep.
I think it helps to reach out like that because, again, because especially people in my role, we're kind of
Mhm.
in a bunch of different bubbles that, we can often say, well, that person might be good or that person might be good in a way that may not come across, either person's radar otherwise.
Yeah, I think that that's really, really key and important. You've got to get out of your own echo chamber, but it is hard to do that in these roles because all of your time it has to be focused on your bubble. And I think when I think about what a successful board looks like for MVOC, that is a variety of backgrounds, a variety of ages. It is gender diversity. It is people of color, and really, for me particularly in veterans. I know 60-year-old plus Vietnam veterans, right? That is who is living in our area. And so if I want to stretch out of that, I've got to go to people like you who
Right.
are in other circles and can make recommendations. And it's not that I don't want the representation of the Vietnam veterans on my board, but it can't be all of that because
Right.
again, you're just
It
going to
can't be
keep hearing
exclusive.
what you want to hear.
Well, one thing I found, I mean, my district is rural. I've lived here my whole life. I find that rural areas tend to be more recommendation driven than
Mhm.
anything else. You tend not to get, um, you tend not to get a whole lot of response from like cold calls, or or walk-ins, quite frankly. Someone's gonna want someone to vouch for you. That just kind of, I think in rural settings, that's a much more important thing.
Yeah.
Someone's gonna want to say, "Oh yeah, MVOC, they're good. You can go there. You can trust them."
Yeah.
You know, as
You want to
opposed to
say, I got a guy.
right, right. No, exactly. That's kind of, and again, it goes back to kind of like the way that, information travels differently in rural settings versus, closer to big population centers, and just the way people have been accustomed to kind of going about things. That sort of personal touch, is really important in terms of connecting, people with resources and services.
Yeah, for sure. It's a reference check, which we all need in one capacity or another.
Mm.
Well, with that, I think we've reached our time. So thank you so much, John, for joining
Welcome.
us today. I really appreciate it. And for everybody watching, make sure you check for the question prompts. Don't forget to respond to all of the prompts, as well as at least two of your fellow classmates by Sunday at 10 p.m.